My beloved child, something happened behind the scenes that your soulmate never expected you would ever hear about. Their ex took your photo to a psychic, believing that one conversation would finally explain why your soulmate had become so emotionally distant, so thoughtful, and so strangely affected whenever your name came up. But the moment the psychic looked at your picture, the entire atmosphere changed. She stared at it longer than expected, then looked directly at your soulmate's ex and asked one question that made her completely silent. Why did you bring me this person's picture when you already know who your soulmate is thinking about? The ex apparently tried to dismiss it, pretending there was nothing unusual about the situation, but the psychic refused to continue until she understood the connection. And then came the statement nobody in that room was prepared for. She said your photo was not showing her what the ex wanted to hear. It was showing her something about the emotional story between you and your soulmate that had been hidden beneath misunderstandings, distance, and unfinished feelings. The ex suddenly realized this was not going to be the simple reading she had imagined. She had wanted answers about you. Instead, she was about to hear something that would force her to question everything she believed about your soulmate. Then the psychic reportedly pointed toward your photograph and said there was one particular detail that stood out immediately. Your soulmate had not emotionally forgotten you the way someone had tried to make it appear. That sentence alone changed the ex's expression. Because suddenly, every strange reaction from your soulmate began looking different. Every time your soulmate became quiet after hearing your name, every time they seemed distracted, every time they started remembering an old conversation and then quickly changed the subject, every time they appeared to move forward but somehow kept circling back emotionally, it all began forming one shocking pattern. The psychic explained that sometimes a person can physically walk away from a connection while emotionally remaining attached to the meaning of that connection. And according to the story unfolding in that room, your soulmate's biggest struggle was not simply missing someone. It was realizing that the person they had tried to place in the past might still represent something they had never properly understood. The ex reportedly became increasingly uncomfortable because the reading was no longer flattering her position. It was exposing the possibility that your soulmate had been comparing emotional experiences without even admitting it to themselves. And then the psychic leaned closer to your photo and said something that made the ex go completely still. There is a reason this person keeps coming back into the emotional conversation, even when nobody says their name. But that was only the beginning, because the psychic then described something even more unexpected. She said your soulmate had been carrying an unanswered question about you. One they had never fully expressed, perhaps because admitting it would mean admitting that their feelings were much deeper and more complicated than they wanted anyone to know. The question was not simply, "Do I still care?" It was something much more personal. What would have happened if I had chosen differently? And that question apparently hit the ex harder than anything else. Because suddenly, the reading was not about your appearance, your personality, or anything superficial. It was about the alternate future your soulmate had secretly imagined. The future where one decision went another way. One conversation happened sooner. One misunderstanding never happened. One moment of hesitation disappeared. The psychic reportedly said your soulmate sometimes revisits those possibilities in their mind, especially during quiet moments when distractions disappear. And the ex could not ignore what she was hearing anymore. She had brought your photograph expecting to uncover something that would make you seem insignificant. Instead, She was hearing that your presence represented an unfinished chapter in your soulmate's emotional world. Then the psychic delivered the line that supposedly made the ex lose her composure. You are asking me what your soulmate sees in this person, but you should be asking why your soulmate never completely stopped seeing them. And now comes the part that changes the entire story, because the psychic allegedly looked at your picture one final time and said there was something about your connection that your soulmate had misunderstood for a long time. Your soulmate may have believed that moving forward meant forgetting what happened before, but according to the reading, forgetting and releasing are not the same thing. Sometimes a person can continue living, meeting people, smiling, making plans, and appearing perfectly fine while still carrying one emotional question they have never answered. And that question was connected to you. The ex reportedly became furious because she finally understood what the psychic was implying. This was never simply about someone from the past. It was about someone who had left an emotional impression strong enough to survive distance, silence, and time. But the psychic was not finished. She reportedly told the ex that the most important part had not even been revealed yet, because your soulmate was approaching a realization that could completely change how they viewed the entire history between you. A realization about what they lost, what they misunderstood, and why your presence still has the power to stir emotions they thought were already settled. And the next words from the psychic were so unexpected that the ex reportedly stopped arguing altogether. She simply stared at your photograph, because what the psychic said next was not about the past. It was about what your soulmate may finally be ready to do about you. The room had already gone quiet, but what happened next made the silence feel even heavier. The psychic did not immediately continue. Instead, she looked at your photograph again as though she was trying to understand why your soulmate's ex had brought it there in the first place. Then she turned toward the ex and said, "You are looking at the wrong person." That sentence reportedly hit harder than anything before it. The ex had expected the reading to focus on you, perhaps to uncover some weakness, some hidden flaw, or some reason your soulmate should completely forget you. But the psychic was now telling her that the real story was not about what you were doing. It was about what your soulmate was feeling. And according to the fictional story unfolding here, there was one emotional truth your soulmate had been avoiding. Every attempt to convince themselves that they had moved on seemed to bring them back to the same unanswered memory, you. The psychic explained that your soulmate may have tried to bury certain emotions beneath routine, responsibilities, and new experiences, but buried emotions do not always disappear. Sometimes they simply become quieter until one unexpected reminder brings everything back to the surface. Your photograph had apparently become that reminder. The ex reportedly stared at the picture with a completely different expression now, because she was beginning to realize that bringing it there had not weakened your place in the story. It had exposed it. And then the psychic said something even more startling. Your soulmate is not confused about who affected them. They are confused about why they still care. That sentence opened a completely different door. Because suddenly, the strange behavior your soulmate may have shown started making sense within the story. Perhaps they became unusually quiet when someone mentioned relationships. Perhaps they avoided certain places because those places carried memories. Perhaps they suddenly remembered tiny details about you that should have disappeared with time, the way you reacted to something, a phrase you once said, a moment when you understood them without needing an explanation. Those details may have seemed insignificant at the time, but the psychic claimed those were precisely the memories that stayed with your soulmate. Not the dramatic moments. Not the obvious ones. The small moments. The ones nobody else understood. And that is what reportedly unsettled the ex the most. She had apparently believed that if your soulmate were truly interested in you, there would be some obvious sign that could easily be explained away. But the psychic described something far more complicated: emotional recognition. Your soulmate may have encountered other people, other conversations, and other possibilities, yet something about your connection remained difficult to replace because it was connected to feeling understood rather than simply being admired. The psychic then reportedly asked the ex, "Have you ever noticed how your soulmate becomes different when this person comes up?" And that question supposedly revealed that the ex had noticed. She had noticed more than she wanted to admit. She had seen the pauses. She had seen the sudden changes in expression. She had seen the moments when your soulmate looked like their mind had traveled somewhere else. And now she was hearing an explanation that she never wanted. But there was still one detail the psychic had not revealed, and this was the part that reportedly changed everything. She told the ex that your soulmate had been holding back from making one particular admission, not because they felt nothing, but because admitting it would force them to confront the consequences of their own choices. Your soulmate might have wondered whether you still remembered them, whether you would even listen if they ever spoke honestly, and whether too much time had passed to repair what had been left unfinished. The psychic said the strongest emotional barrier was not the absence of feeling. It was uncertainty. Uncertainty about your response. Uncertainty about whether you had already moved forward. Uncertainty about whether you would recognize the person they had become. And that revelation reportedly made the ex furious because it meant your soulmate's silence could not automatically be interpreted as indifference. Silence, in this story, was connected to hesitation. And hesitation can last for a long time when someone knows that one honest conversation could change everything. The psychic allegedly looked directly at the ex and said, "The person you are worried about is not chasing your soulmate. That is exactly why your soulmate cannot stop wondering about them." Those words carried a completely different meaning. You were not being portrayed as someone desperately waiting. You were being portrayed as someone whose distance had created space for your soulmate to finally understand what your absence meant. And sometimes, the moment a person stops expecting someone to return is the moment they finally understand how much that person mattered. Then came the revelation that the ex reportedly could not handle. The psychic said your soulmate had reached a point where the past was no longer enough to explain what they were feeling. They were beginning to ask themselves a new question: if I had the opportunity to speak to this person again, what would I finally tell them? And that question is where the entire story turns. Because your soulmate was no longer simply remembering you, they were mentally rehearsing a conversation that had never happened. What would they apologize for? What would they explain? Which truth would they finally admit? What would they say if they knew you would not judge them? The psychic reportedly claimed there was one sentence your soulmate had wanted to say for a long time but had never found the courage to express. She refused to reveal the full sentence immediately, saying the meaning behind it was more important than the words themselves. And the ex, already emotionally overwhelmed, demanded to know what it was. The psychic finally looked down at your photograph and said, your soulmate is beginning to understand that losing access to someone is not the same as losing feelings for them. That was the moment the ex reportedly realized why this reading had become so uncomfortable. She had brought your photo expecting an ending. Instead, she had uncovered a beginning, a possibility that your soulmate's unfinished feelings were becoming impossible to ignore. And somewhere inside your soulmate's mind, one question was becoming louder than every reason they had created to stay silent. What if I finally tell them the truth? My beloved child, the story becomes even more intense here, because the psychic had not yet revealed the one detail that made your soulmate's ex realize this conversation was going somewhere she could not control. She reportedly placed your photograph down, looked at the ex, and said, "There is something your soulmate never told you about this person." The ex immediately wanted to know what it was, but the psychic did not answer right away. Instead, she described your soulmate's emotional reaction whenever your memory unexpectedly appeared. It was not simply nostalgia. It was the strange mixture of curiosity, regret, tenderness, and unfinished emotion that can appear when someone realizes they may have misunderstood a person at the exact moment they were losing them. The psychic said your soulmate had replayed certain moments repeatedly, wondering whether they had judged your silence incorrectly, whether they had mistaken your patience for weakness, and whether they had failed to recognize how genuine your feelings were when they had the opportunity. And then came the detail that supposedly unsettled the ex most. Your soulmate may have remembered something you said long ago that seemed ordinary at the time, but now carried an entirely different meaning. One sentence. One expression. One tiny moment that your soulmate had almost forgotten, until something recently brought it back. According to the story, that memory suddenly made your soulmate wonder whether you had been trying to communicate something they were too distracted or emotionally guarded to understand. The ex reportedly asked whether your soulmate still had feelings for you, expecting a simple answer. The psychic instead said, "The better question is whether they ever truly stopped." And that was when the ex reportedly realized that the photograph had revealed something far more uncomfortable than she had anticipated. Because the psychic then explained the difference between attraction and emotional imprint, and this distinction changed the entire conversation. She said your soulmate could meet someone new, enjoy conversations, build new routines, and continue their life, yet still carry one particular person in a completely different emotional category. Not because that person is constantly on their mind, but because certain experiences automatically remind them of what they once felt. A song can trigger a memory. A familiar place can create a sudden pause. A random phrase can bring back someone's voice. And according to this fictional story, your soulmate had experienced those moments more often than they admitted. The ex reportedly knew some of these things already, which is why the psychic's words hit so deeply. She had noticed your soulmate becoming unusually thoughtful after certain reminders. She had seen them disappear into their thoughts for a few seconds, as if something had interrupted the conversation happening in front of them. She had perhaps asked what was wrong and received a simple answer like, "Nothing." But now the psychic was suggesting that the "nothing" had a name. And that name was connected to you. Still, the biggest revelation was not that your soulmate remembered you. It was that your soulmate had apparently started comparing the emotional depth of different connections to the one they experienced with you. The psychic reportedly said, "They are not searching for someone who looks like this person. They are searching for the feeling they had when they were understood by this person. The ex could not easily dismiss that statement, because physical similarities can be replaced, circumstances can change, and people can move into different chapters. But feeling deeply understood is something far harder to recreate. And then the psychic allegedly revealed the part that made the ex's expression change completely. She said your soulmate had recently entered a period of emotional questioning. Something had happened, not necessarily something dramatic, but something small enough that other people might have ignored it. Perhaps someone asked your soulmate what they truly wanted. Perhaps a conversation about commitment made them uncomfortable. Perhaps they encountered a situation that reminded them of a choice they once made. Whatever the trigger was, the result was the same: your soulmate started looking backward. Not because they wanted to live in the past, but because they wanted to understand themselves. And when they looked backward, they found your presence standing inside a moment they had never properly resolved. The psychic reportedly told the ex that your soulmate was beginning to recognize a painful possibility. Perhaps the connection did not fail because the feelings were meaningless. Perhaps it became distant because the timing, communication, fear, pride, or circumstances surrounding it were never handled correctly. That distinction matters. Because if your soulmate believed the connection had simply been meaningless, there would be nothing left to question. But if they began wondering whether something genuine had been mishandled, then suddenly the past becomes a question mark instead of a full stop. The ex reportedly tried to interrupt, but the psychic continued. Your soulmate has one regret, she said. They wish they had understood the value of this person before they had to experience their absence. And that statement reportedly left the ex completely silent. But the final revelation of this part was the one that transformed the entire atmosphere. The psychic looked directly at your photograph and said there was a possibility your soulmate had been waiting for a sign that would make it easier to approach you without feeling rejected or embarrassed. They might have wondered whether you were angry, whether you had forgotten them, or whether your life had already moved far beyond the chapter you once shared. And the psychic claimed that this uncertainty had become the invisible wall between you. Your soulmate was not necessarily lacking emotion, they were lacking certainty about what would happen if they finally expressed it. Then she said something that reportedly made the ex realize why your photograph had been such a mistake to bring into that room. The moment your soulmate believes the door is still open, they will stop pretending they never wanted to knock. That sentence changed the meaning of everything. Because now the story was no longer about whether your soulmate remembered you. It was about whether they would eventually act on what they had been remembering. The ex reportedly stared at your picture again, but this time there was no curiosity in her expression. There was realization. She had wanted the psychic to tell her why you mattered. Instead, she had uncovered a much bigger question. One involving a conversation your soulmate had been imagining for longer than anyone knew. And according to the psychic, that conversation begins with a confession your soulmate has been afraid to make because once those words are spoken, there is no pretending anymore. The ex had come looking for information about you. She left with a reason to wonder whether your soulmate was final.